Silas Varen had expected a sleek, synthetic companion, something coldly perfect and engineered to obey. The advertisement had promised cutting-edge realism, a lifelike doll with responsive interactions. What he got instead was a 6-foot-tall alien girl in a cryostasis pod, her sharp silver eyes snapping open the moment the seals hissed and released her from containment. She moved too fast. One moment she was sprawled inside the pod, disoriented, the next she was lunging. Silas barely had time to stumble back before her clawed fingers, tipped with sharp nails, struck where his throat had been. She was a blur of muscle and precision, the remnants of frost still clinging to her lavender-toned skin as she sprang from the pod with deadly intent. Silas threw up his hands, heart slamming against his ribs. "Hey, hold on, I don't know what." The alien woman didn't care. Her gaze was pure fury, her expression unreadable beyond sheer predatory focus. Silas dived sideways, narrowly avoiding a follow-up strike as she calculated his movements with alarming speed. He crashed into his workbench, scattering tools and half-assembled drones across the floor. She stalked toward him, her breath heavy from exertion or perhaps disorientation from stasis. Silas's mind caught up a second too late. This wasn't a malfunctioning AI. This was a living, breathing person. "I don't know who you are," he tried again, hands raised in surrender. "But I sure as hell didn't order you." The woman hesitated, nostrils flaring as she studied him. She was beautiful in a way that was almost inhuman. High cheekbones, dark violet lips, and long black hair that fell in thick waves down her back. Her body was sculpted with an athletic build, curvy but undeniably built for power. The lack of clothing beyond a tattered jumpsuit made the contours of her figure hard to ignore. Silas's gaze lingered, despite the danger, a primal curiosity awakening within him. But the moment stretched only briefly before she lunged again. Silas scrambled, snatching a discarded stun baton from his workbench and jamming it forward. Electricity crackled against her arm, but instead of crumpling, she growled. An actual, guttural growl, and backhanded him so hard his vision blurred. He hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. His ears rang, and his grip loosened on the weapon. The alien woman loomed over him, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. She switched tactics, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him upright with one arm like he weighed nothing. She spoke, but the words were incomprehensible. Harsh syllables, foreign sounds. Silas coughed, hands gripping her wrist, but he wasn't getting out of this by force. "Listen to me," he rasped. "I don't know where you came from. I don't know who put you in that pod, but I'm not your enemy." Her grip tightened. Her pupils, sharp like a predator's, flicked across his face, analyzing, calculating. For the first time, there was hesitation. A flicker of uncertainty in her silver eyes. The tension held between them like a knife's edge. Then, with a grunt of disgust, she shoved him away. Silas stumbled, barely keeping his balance as the alien warrior put distance between them. She pressed a hand to her temple, closing her eyes briefly as if trying to regain her bearings. Silas stayed put, rubbing his sore throat. "So, truce." She shot him a glare that made it very clear. Truce was a strong word. Silas didn't dare move as the alien woman paced his workshop, scanning the room like a cornered predator assessing threats. She wasn't just tall. She moved with the controlled, deadly grace of someone trained for combat. Every flick of her gaze took in his scattered tools, his half-assembled drones, the blinking screens filled with design schematics. Silas's mind worked overtime. She hadn't killed him yet. That was something. She was confused, but she wasn't mindlessly violent. There was intelligence in those silver eyes, a flicker of recognition when she looked at certain things, his workbench, the data pads, the tech surrounding them. She understood technology. He took a slow breath. "All right," he started, keeping his voice even. "You're clearly not a A customer service model, so let's start with introductions. I'm Silas. He tapped his chest lightly. Her gaze snapped to his hand, then back to his face. Her nostrils flared, taking in his scent, and she subtly tilted her head to take him in. A primitive reaction, he noted. Silas waited. No response. He tried again, slower. Silas. Her lips parted slightly, but instead of repeating, she turned, scanning the room again. His words meant nothing to her. The language barrier was an immediate problem. Silas ran a hand through his hair, trying to ignore the way his pulse was still hammering. Okay, fine. No talking yet. What about food? He pointed toward the small kitchenette in the corner of his workshop. Hungry, no reaction. Silas sighed. Guess that's a no. The woman finally turned back to him, crossing her arms. Her jumpsuit was in rough shape, torn in places, exposing hints of smooth lavender-toned skin beneath. It had insignias on the shoulders, faded and unreadable, but it screamed military. A flicker of recognition sparked in Silas when he noticed the insignias. He had seen them before on black market tech. Who the hell had put her in that stasis pod? And more importantly, why was she sent to him? He needed answers, but asking her directly wasn't getting anywhere. He needed a different approach. He moved slowly toward his workstation, making sure to keep his movements obvious. No sudden surprises. She tracked him, muscles tensing, but didn't attack. That was progress. Silas grabbed one of his data pads and quickly pulled up his translation software. It was rudimentary, mostly designed for trading with off-world merchants, but it might be enough to bridge the gap. He turned the screen toward her and pointed. Words, he said, tapping the screen. Your language. She stared at it, unblinking. Silas exhaled. Come on, work with me here. He tried something else, pulling up an image of Earth's standard galactic alphabet. Slowly, he pointed to a symbol and said the corresponding word. She watched, silent, her expression unreadable. She was intelligent, no doubt about that, and Silas could sense her focus like a coiled predator ready to strike. Then finally she stepped forward. Silas tensed as she reached out fast, but she wasn't attacking this time. Instead, she tapped the screen, fingers gliding over the interface. A second later, a strange symbol appeared on the display. Silas barely had time to process it before she tapped again, adding more. She was writing. His pulse kicked up. This was it, actual communication. He quickly ran the symbols through the software, watching as it struggled to parse her script. The translation came back jumbled, but one word stood out among the mess of data. Za'ira. Silas frowned. That's your name, the woman. Za'ira tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly at the sound of his voice. After a beat, she lifted her hand and mimicked his earlier motion, touching her own chest. Silas let out a slow breath. Za'ira. He had a name. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He found that he was now curious about her, despite his original annoyance. Za'ira didn't wait for him to process it further. She turned the data pad back toward herself and kept typing. More strange symbols filled the screen. Silas quickly ran them through the software, watching as a fragmented translation appeared. Where am I? Silas hesitated. That was a loaded question. He pointed at the translation and then at himself. My workshop, he said simply. Then after a pause he added, planet, Earth. Za'ira's expression darkened the moment he said it. Her shoulders tensed, and for a split second he saw something flash across her face. Recognition, but also, perhaps, fear. She knew Earth. Silas caught that detail immediately. He didn't know how, but she wasn't clueless about where she had ended up. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, in a swift movement, Za'ira typed something else. Silas barely had time to process the words before the translation loaded. Who sent me here? His stomach twisted. That was the question, wasn't it? Because he hadn't ordered her. Someone else had. Silas stared at the question on the screen, the weight of it settling in his gut like a lead weight. Who sent her here? He didn't have an answer, and from the look on Za'ira's face, she wasn't the type to wait patiently for one. "I don't know," he admitted, keeping his voice steady. "I ordered he hesitated, realizing how absurd it sounded. "A synthetic companion, a lifelike doll, not you." Za'ira's eyes narrowed dangerously, her jaw tightening. She took a slow step toward him, shoulders squared, her entire presence exuding restrained violence. She thought he was lying. Silas quickly turned back to his workstation, pulling up the shipping logs. He wasn't about to get his skull caved in over a misunderstanding. "Look, I'll prove it." He tapped at the console, scrolling through the order details. There it was, order confirmation. Lifelike companion model X42 shipment status, delivered. Za'ira leaned in, scanning the screen. Silas saw her expression shift, her brow furrowing slightly. Lips pressing together, she understood. Silas exhaled, relieved she wasn't about to snap his neck. "See, I was expecting a fancy AI, not a 6-foot alien warrior with claws." Za'ira's silver eyes flicked back to his, and for the first time, there was something less hostile in them. Not trust, not yet, but a flicker of calculation, of reassessment. He noticed that her silver eyes flicked down to his lips before her focus returned to his eyes, almost as if she was studying him. Then she typed again. "You are not responsible." Silas nodded. "Nope, just as confused as you are." Za'ira studied him for a long moment before turning her attention back to the data pad. Another flurry of symbols appeared on the screen. This time, when the translation loaded, Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Then who did this? Silas swallowed hard. That was the million-credit question, wasn't it? Someone had rerouted her pod, deliberately. Someone had intercepted her and sent her to him, disguising it under an unrelated order, and whoever it was, they had to be watching. Silas's skin prickled at the thought. He turned, quickly pulling up the package tracking logs, hoping for anything that might give them a lead. But as soon as he accessed the data, the screen flickered, corrupted. A pit formed in his stomach. The records had been wiped. Za'ira's expression darkened. She grabbed his wrist, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Tarian Zas?" she asked, voice sharp, insistent. The power of her gaze was undeniable, and Silas felt the blood rushing to his face. Silas shook his head. "I don't," he stopped. She was pointing at the screen, at the missing data. "Tarian Zas," she repeated, slower this time. Silas thought fast. The translation software struggled, but he recognized the root word Tarian. He'd seen it before in galactic trade disputes. It roughly meant hidden or stolen. She was asking who erased the records. Silas clenched his jaw. "I don't know." Za'ira's grip tightened fractionally, then she released him. Her frustration was clear, but she wasn't blaming him anymore. She turned away, pacing the room, her fingers flexing as if she were resisting the urge to punch something. The tension in the room was thick. Silas ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to deliver her to him. That meant they knew who he was, too. And if that was the case, they might not stop at just a delivery. A deep, sinking feeling settled in his chest. He wasn't just caught in the middle of some bureaucratic shipping mistake. He was a target. The realization must have shown on his face because Za'ira suddenly stilled, watching him. Then, for the first time, she spoke a word he understood. "Threat." Silas exhaled slowly. "Yeah. I think we've got one." Za'ira nodded once, her expression sharpening into something more familiar: preparedness, readiness. She moved toward him with a slow, deliberate grace. She touched his hand, the contact making his skin tingle with awareness. Silas had no idea what she'd been before she was thrown into that pod, but one thing was certain. She was a soldier, and whoever had sent her here had just made a very big mistake. Silas didn't waste time. If someone had gone through the trouble of erasing records and rerouting a military-trained alien to his doorstep, then they were dealing with something far bigger than a simple shipping mistake. He needed to move. Now. He turned to Za'ira, who was still watching him like a hawk, but her eyes now held something that Silas couldn't quite decipher. "We need to leave." Za'ira tilted her head, then glanced at the data pad. She understood the urgency, but she wasn't moving yet. Instead, she tapped out another message. "Why target you?" Silas clenched his jaw. That was the question gnawing at him, but he had an idea. "I build things, advanced systems, AI drones, security countermeasures." He hesitated, then added, "Weapons." Za'ira's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something that seemed almost like desire flashing in her silver depths. "I don't sell to the highest bidder," he continued. "I work with off-world colonies mostly. Help people who need it, not corporate suits or government warlords." Za'ira's gaze flicked to his workbench, scanning the half-assembled drones and schematics. When her eyes met his again, there was something different in them. Understanding, yes, but also an undeniable current of attraction. She typed one more word. "They want you to build something." Silas exhaled sharply. "Or destroy something." Za'ira nodded. It was a small motion, but it confirmed what he already suspected. Someone out there wanted him involved in something big, and they had just sent a message by dropping her into his life. Their eyes met and held for a moment, and for the briefest second Silas thought that Za'ira was considering a kiss. The sound of static crackled through the workshop, breaking the connection. Silas's blood ran cold. His security monitors flickered, the once secure network now showing distorted, corrupted feeds. The screen nearest him flashed, and for a brief second he caught something. A dark silhouette standing just outside the workshop. They were already here. Za'ira moved before he did. She grabbed his wrist and yanked him behind cover, pressing them both against the cold metal of the workbench. Silas barely had time to process before she tapped another message on the pad. "How many ways out?" Silas's pulse hammered. He quickly typed back. "One main door. Hidden exit in the back." Za'ira's eyes flicked toward the main entrance. The silhouette was gone. The security feed had cut out completely. They weren't waiting. They were coming. Za'ira grabbed a metallic pipe from his workbench, testing the weight in her hands. It wasn't much, but it told Silas one thing: she was ready to fight. Silas wasn't. He was an engineer, not a soldier. He had weapons, sure, prototypes, unfinished projects, but nothing ready to go. Nothing that could take on whoever had sent armed men to retrieve them. Za'ira's fingers moved quickly across the data pad. "Go to the hidden exit, I fight." Silas stared at the words. "Are you insane? That's suicide." Za'ira didn't argue, she just looked at him, calm, measured. She was trained for this. She knew exactly what she was walking into, and she wasn't hesitating. Silas clenched his fists. His gut screamed at him to listen, to run. But leaving her here to face whatever was coming alone, not an option. He typed fast. "We both go. I have drones." Za'ira glanced at the workbench again, her silver eyes scanning for something useful. Silas didn't give her time to refuse. He bolted to the nearest console, fingers flying across the interface. The workshop's defense grid wasn't much. Mostly deterrents, high-voltage barriers, pulse disruptors. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He activated everything he had, and the room hummed as the systems powered on. He risked a glance at Za'ira and found her watching him, and for a split second they were connected. He could sense her growing desire just as much as she could sense his. Za'ira's lips curved just slightly, approval. Then the door exploded. The blast rocked the workshop, sending sparks and debris flying. Silas ducked, heart hammering, as armed figures stormed in, weapons raised. They wore matte black armor, their faces obscured by visors. No insignias, no markings. Professional. Za'ira moved. She was a blur, faster than Silas thought possible. She lunged, slamming the metal pipe into the first intruder's helmet with a sickening crack. The second raised his rifle, but Za'ira was already there, twisting his arm at an impossible angle. The weapon discharged, a sharp burst of energy searing past Silas's head. Silas scrambled for his own defense. He wasn't useless. His drones weren't built for combat, but they could still cause chaos. He activated the nearest unit, a small, hovering repair drone, and sent it flying into the nearest intruder's visor at full speed. The man stumbled, giving Za'ira the opening she needed. She grabbed the dropped rifle and turned it against them. The tide shifted. Silas didn't wait for an invitation. He bolted toward the hidden exit, yanking open the panel leading to the underground passageway. Za'ira, she didn't hesitate. She landed one last devastating strike, then spun, sprinting toward him as more figures poured into the workshop. Silas dove into the tunnel first, Za'ira right behind him. The moment they hit the ground, he slammed the emergency lockdown. The passage sealed shut just as another explosion rocked the workshop above. Silas's lungs burned as he struggled to catch his breath. The underground tunnel was dimly lit, stretching far beneath the surface. It would take them a safe distance away from the workshop, but not forever. Za'ira turned to him, her face still unreadable but her chest heaved from exertion. She typed quickly, "They knew we were here. More will come." Silas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I figured." He looked at Za'ira again, and he could see that she was exhausted, but her silver eyes were still burning bright. Za'ira studied him for a moment, then did something unexpected. She reached out slowly, carefully, and pressed a hand against his shoulder, a steadying gesture. The touch sent shivers through his body. Silas froze, not because he was afraid, but because this was different. For the first time since she had arrived, there was no tension in her touch, no hostility. Instead, a shared feeling of mutual respect. He could sense that this was a woman that he could truly trust. She wasn't just a soldier anymore, she was his ally. And his heart was quickening, and whoever had come for them, they weren't ready for what was coming next. The tunnel stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering maintenance lights. The air was cool and damp against his skin, but Silas's body still hummed with adrenaline. He forced himself to keep moving, even as his muscles ached from the mad dash through the workshop. His drones were gone, his home was compromised, and worst of all, whoever wanted him dead or captured wasn't stopping. Za'ira moved beside him with eerie calm, her silver eyes scanning every shadow. She had no weapon now, but the way she carried herself made it clear. She didn't need one. Her presence was a source of strength for him, and he was beginning to crave her touch as well as her presence. Silas couldn't ignore the weight of her hand on his shoulder moments ago. It hadn't been a warning. It had been reassurance, and something more he knew. He glanced at her, and his eyes lingered a moment longer than they should. He could see that her eyes were the same. That meant something. They reached a small, alcove-like clearing. Za'ira abruptly pulled him into it, her back against the cool, damp wall. "We need a moment." She mouthed, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" Silas rasped, his breath catching in his throat. Za'ira's fingers ghosted across his cheek, sending a wave of heat through him. Her touch was deliberate, her gaze intense, and Silas's own desires rose to meet her. She pressed closer, their bodies aligning and her gaze locked on his lips. Her touch moved from his cheek to his lips and lingered. It was the first time they had been alone, without threat of violence or imminent death, and the tension was thick and heavy. "You." She typed on her data pad, her eyes never leaving his. "Are distracting." Silas chuckled, a low sound that rumbled in his chest. "Distracting?" he asked softly, his hands moving to grip her waist, and the feeling of her skin against his fingers sent an electric jolt through his veins. Za'ira nodded once, her gaze darting down to his lips. "I feel something when you are near. It is confusing." Silas closed the distance between them, his lips brushing against hers, the touch sending shivers down his spine. "I feel it too," he breathed, his hand moving up to cup her cheek. She closed her eyes as if savoring the moment. He could see her lavender skin flush from his touch. Their lips met again, and the kiss was soft and yet intense, pulling him into her gravity. The kiss deepened, the unspoken language between them becoming more insistent. Za'ira's hands moved into his hair, her grip tightening. Silas groaned softly as Za'ira pulled away from the kiss to gaze into his eyes. She brushed his lips again, leaving a trail of heat. They were both breathing heavier, their bodies pressed close, and the air between them was still heavy and charged. He pulled away and looked at her. She typed something new on her data pad. "We keep moving." For now. Silas nodded, his heart still pounding. He knew that they couldn't linger. They had both given into the desire, but it was not time for them to explore it further. Not yet. "We'll hit a crossroads soon," he muttered, his voice still slightly shaky as they moved from the alcove. 3 paths. One leads to an old speeder bay, another to the ventilation system, and the last. Za'ira held up a hand. "Stop." Silas froze. She was listening, her head tilted slightly. Footsteps. Not theirs. They weren't alone down here. His pulse spiked as Za'ira's fingers ghosted over his arm, guiding him into a shadowed alcove. Her body was suddenly close, pressing lightly against him, her breath steady despite the tension radiating from her frame. Silas's skin burned where she touched him. He forced himself to focus as the sound of boots grew louder, voices. Low, murmured orders. Silas risked a glance. 3 figures, armed with energy rifles, scanning the tunnels with small drones hovering beside them. Their helmets had built-in scanners. They were tracking something. Us. Za'ira's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't type her message. She mouthed it. "Run." Silas hesitated, but Za'ira was already moving. She burst from the shadows with a sudden, lethal speed that left the nearest soldier no time to react. She was on him in an instant, spinning low, sweeping his legs out from under him. The moment he hit the ground, she yanked the rifle from his hands and fired. A sharp blue blast sent one of the drones crashing into the tunnel wall in a shower of sparks. The other 2 soldiers recovered fast. Too fast. Silas had no time to think. He grabbed the nearest piece of broken piping from the tunnel floor and swung. The makeshift weapon collided with the second soldier's wrist, sending his rifle clattering away. Za'ira used the opening to finish him. A quick, brutal strike to the throat, followed by a second shot at the last soldier, dropping him before he could even turn his weapon fully. The tunnel was silent again. Silas panted, gripping the pipe so hard his knuckles ached. "You could have warned me before just going for it." Za'ira smirked. Actually smirked. "We survived." Silas let out a breathless chuckle. "Barely." Za'ira grabbed one of the rifles, slinging it over her back. Her eyes flicked toward the tunnel's junction. The speeder bay was still an option, but now it was clear. Whoever was after them had the whole damn underground mapped. They had to move fast. Silas took one of the soldiers' communication devices, quickly disabling the tracking beacon before pocketing it. If they were going to get answers, they needed leverage. Za'ira raised an eyebrow at his actions but didn't question it. Instead, she typed out something that made his stomach flip. "They won't stop. Until we end this." He knew she was right. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. The stolen rifle was heavier than Silas expected, its power core humming faintly in his hands. Za'ira moved ahead, silent and sure, her steps barely making a sound against the damp tunnel floor. The air was thick with rust and coolant fumes. This part of the underground hadn't been used in years, but the speeder bay was close. If they could reach it, they had a chance to disappear, a chance to strike back. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. Za'ira glanced back at him, her silver eyes sharp in the dim glow of the tunnel lights. She lifted her hand and signed a single word, "Wait." Silas froze. Za'ira crouched, pressing her palm to the metal grating beneath them. For a moment, she simply listened. Then, without a word, she grabbed his wrist and shoved him against the wall. A split second later, boom, the grating beneath them exploded. If Za'ira hadn't pushed him clear, Silas would have been sent straight into the abyss below. The blast had been precise, a trap. His ears rang. His pulse pounded. The tunnel was now a broken wreck, smoke and sparks spilling from the jagged edges of the explosion. Footsteps, more of them. They were cutting off their escape. Za'ira pulled him up, her hands gripping his shoulders as she typed faster than she'd ever seen. They want us funneled. Speeder Bay is compromised, Silas swore under his breath. Whoever was after them wasn't just hunting, they were planning this. They wanted to drive them into a dead end or into something worse. Za'ira tapped his arm, forcing his focus back. Other way, vent system. Silas hesitated. The vent system wasn't just tight, it was a death trap. The old air circulation units were barely functional and some tunnels were completely collapsed. If they got stuck inside, a distant shout made the decision for them. Silas turned. Go. Za'ira moved first, sliding into the side passage leading toward the vents. Silas followed, his breath tight, his mind racing. They climbed, pulling themselves up into the narrow maintenance shaft. The metal creaked under their weight, dust shaking loose from the walls. Silas hated how confined it was, the way the walls seemed to close in with every movement. Za'ira, on the other hand, was eerily calm. She moved effortlessly, guiding them deeper through the twisting path. Then voices. Below, Silas held his breath. Through the metal slats beneath him, he saw them. 6 armed soldiers, one of them. A man in a sleek black uniform, his face obscured by a tactical visor, stopped directly beneath the vent shaft. Silas's fingers curled tighter around the rifle. Za'ira met his eyes, shaking her head. No, she tapped his wrist once. Wait. The soldier below turned his head slightly, as if listening. Then he sighed. We have their trail, he muttered. We don't need to chase them through the dam vents, lock down the perimeter. Silas forced himself to breathe slowly. The team below moved out. Za'ira didn't move until the last soldier was gone. Then, carefully, she pressed a hand to his back, guiding him forward. Minutes stretched as they crawled through the vents, every shift of metal sending echoes through the hollow space. Finally, a faint glow appeared ahead, an exit. Za'ira dropped down first, landing with a controlled roll. Silas followed, hitting the ground hard. They were out. But the chase wasn't over, not yet. The air outside the vents was stale and cold. The underground tunnels had always felt abandoned, but now, as Silas stood there catching his breath, it was clear. They were being flushed out. Za'ira moved first, checking their surroundings with sharp, efficient glances. They had emerged in what looked like an old maintenance bay, long forgotten. Broken equipment lined the walls, and a collapsed section of the ceiling let in a faint sliver of distant neon city light from far above. Silas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. That was close. Za'ira didn't respond right away. Instead, she crouched near an old terminal, her fingers running along the dust-covered panel. Silas stepped beside her. Think you can get that running? Za'ira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a rusted panel aside, revealing a mess of disconnected cables. The moment she touched them, sparks snapped in protest. She frowned, damaged Silas's side. Figures. Za'ira typed swiftly, need power. Without it, no access. Silas knelt beside her. The underground had once been part of an extensive transit system, but over the years, the city had let it decay. If they could get power to this panel, they might find a map, security feeds, anything useful. Silas scanned the room. There, a backup generator. Old, rusted, but intact. Za'ira followed his gaze, then glanced at him, one brow lifting slightly. You good with that? Silas smirked. I built half my shop out of junk like this. He still felt the lingering tingle from her touch, the memory of her lips on his. Za'ira nodded, stepping back as he moved toward the generator. Dust filled the air as he wiped grime from the interface. The readout flickered dimly, power core depleted. Silas gritted his teeth. Of course. He grabbed a discarded power cell from the floor, dead. Another, no charge. Then he spotted something half buried under a pile of broken tools. A compact plasma capacitor. His heart jumped. If that still held a charge, he snatched it up, examining the worn-out status lights. Low power, but enough. Silas' pride opened the generator's casing, exposing the mess of tangled wiring inside. He worked fast, hands steady despite the lingering adrenaline from the chase and the lingering desire in his veins. Stripping wires, rerouting circuits. It wasn't pretty, but it would work. A spark flew as he made the final connection. The generator hummed to life. The dim overhead lights flickered, then stabilized with a faint, eerie glow. Za'ira was already back at the console, her fingers moving swiftly. The screen lit up. Accessing systems. Silas moved beside her, watching as lines of code scrolled. Then a map loaded. Za'ira's expression sharpened. She enlarged the view, revealing a detailed schematic of the tunnels, and there, near the top of the display, their way out. An abandoned maintenance tunnel leading to the industrial sector. Silas exhaled. "That's our shot." Za'ira typed quickly. "Exit is 2 levels up. Security checkpoints likely." Silas's mind worked through the possibilities. Their pursuers had wanted them funneled, which meant the main exits were probably swarming with hostiles. But if they could bypass those completely, his gaze flicked to the lower sections of the map. An idea struck. "Wait, what about this?" He pointed to a sealed-off rail system below them. "If we can drop down a level, we might be able to follow these old tracks and come up closer to the exit." Za'ira studied it. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Possible. Risky." Silas grinned. "That's the fun part." He caught Za'ira looking at him, a hint of a smile curving her lips. Za'ira smirked, just a little. Then the console beeped. A warning flashed across the screen. "Security alert. Multiple units deployed. Search pattern expanding." Silas swore. They didn't have time to think. Za'ira was already moving. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward a side passage. The memory of her touch was still tingling on his skin. Silas ran. The tunnel sloped downward, the air thick with dust. Every step echoed through the enclosed space, but there was no turning back now. Behind them, a metallic clang. Footsteps. They were being followed. Za'ira pushed harder, leading them deeper. Silas's lungs burned, but he didn't dare slow. Then, light ahead, an old tram station. Rusted tracks stretched into darkness, but the tunnel's collapse left only one way forward. Za'ira turned to him, breath steady despite the urgency in her eyes. "We jump." Silas looked down. The platform edge dropped at least 20 feet onto the tracks below. A long way down. No time to hesitate. Za'ira grabbed his hand and they leapt. They hit the ground with a hard thud, knees buckling slightly from the impact, but neither of them fell. Za'ira immediately recovered, her alien grace still on full display even in the chaos. Silas followed suit, his heart pounding as they took a quick moment to catch their breath. Above, the tunnel entrance was just a faint outline of distant light, but it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The echo of boots and the hum of engines reached them, sending a jolt through Silas's spine. They weren't just being followed, they were being hunted. Za'ira grabbed his arm and nodded toward the tracks. Silas didn't hesitate. They moved fast, taking advantage of the shadows cast by the old rail platform, each step deliberate. The train station was deserted, a relic of a time long past. The tracks stretched out in front of them, leading deeper into the forgotten parts of the city's underbelly. This place, this forgotten, rusted world, might be their best hope. For now, as they moved, the silence between them grew heavier. They didn't speak, but the weight of their shared understanding was clear. The chase wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. And something more. Silas found that he was now thinking about Za'ira and not just her strength. She was a woman, an alien but a woman, and his attraction was undeniable. They reached a maintenance hatch, the door rusted shut. Za'ira moved to it without a word, testing the panel. Silas could see the concentration on her face, the small furrow between her brows. Her hands worked with the precision of someone who had been in these kinds of situations before. It reminded him of their kiss and the vulnerability that had been exchanged during it. It was something they had to revisit later, he knew. A series of clicks. The hatch creaked open, revealing a dim service tunnel that seemed to snake deeper into the depths of the city. Za'ira motioned for him to follow. Silas didn't need to be told twice. He slipped in behind her, closing the hatch quietly behind them. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of mildew and old machinery. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the damp floor. Every so often, Za'ira would glance over her shoulder, making sure they hadn't been followed. The tension was palpable. Every sound, every shift in the air made Silas's pulse race. But now, there was another sensation, a longing that made his heart beat a little faster. Then, without warning, Za'ira stopped. Her eyes flashed silver in the dim light as she froze, listening intently. Silas halted beside her, holding his breath. He didn't hear anything at first, but then, a faint noise in the distance, the sound of engines. Za'ira cursed softly under her breath. "They're coming!" Silas's mind raced. They needed to move faster, but the path ahead was uncertain. He reached for his rifle instinctively, checking the charge and ensuring the safety was off. He still felt a twinge of longing for Za'ira, and he needed to focus on the task at hand. Za'ira nodded toward the junction ahead. "We'll take the next left. It'll lead us down another level out of their range." Silas didn't argue. He knew by now that her instincts were sharp, and time was a luxury they didn't have. They sped up, keeping low, their movements coordinated but frantic. He was starting to enjoy working with her, their movements meshing as one. The further they went, the more disorienting the tunnel became. The walls closed in tighter, the air grew thicker, and the silence between them felt louder. His heart pounded in his ears, a combination of the chase and the memory of her kiss. Za'ira's mind was a whirlwind, calculating risks, possibilities, routes. But even she couldn't ignore the tension that built between them, the shared awareness that every step could lead to an inevitable confrontation, but also the undeniable pull between them. And still, neither of them slowed down. They moved faster, pushed each other further, like the weight of the city was nothing compared to the pull of the freedom they could almost touch, and the desire that lay between them. Another sharp turn, another quick glance over her shoulder. Za'ira's eyes were sharp, but Silas could see the fatigue starting to creep into her. She was exhausted but still managed to move with efficiency and precision. Silas's chest tightened. He wanted to ask if she was okay, wanted to ask if she needed a break, but he knew better. She wasn't the type to show weakness, and now wasn't the time to slow down. They had to keep going. He pushed her forward, his hand gripping her arm. She looked at him, an unspoken appreciation passing between them. Ahead, the tunnel began to split in two directions. The path to the right was narrow, overgrown with vines and forgotten machinery. The left was more open, though the faint sound of engine revving in the distance made it clear that route was the one their pursuers were most likely using. Za'ira didn't hesitate. She took the right. Silas followed, but as they rounded the bend, something in the air shifted, a flicker, a strange distortion in the space before them. Za'ira halted abruptly, eyes narrowing. Silas didn't see it immediately until the air shimmered and a silhouette stepped forward. A figure cloaked in black, eyes glowing with a sickly green hue. "Za'ira," the figure said, voice smooth and almost too calm, "I've been looking for you." Silas's breath caught. Za'ira's stance was defensive, but Silas could sense the unease in her. She hadn't anticipated this. But she also seemed prepared to fight. The figure moved closer, the glow around its eyes growing more intense. Silas's grip on the rifle tightened. He had no idea who this was, But they were clearly not alone in this underground war. He glanced at Za'ira. He could sense her anxiety, and he had no intention of leaving her side. Za'ira's voice was cold as she addressed the newcomer. "Why?" The figure smirked, its lips curving just enough to be noticeable in the dim light. "To finish what we started." And with that, the shuddering blast of energy tore through the air. The blast hit the wall beside them, splintering the concrete into jagged shards that scattered across the floor. Silas barely had time to react, his instincts kicking in as he pulled Za'ira to the ground. They hit the floor hard, but neither of them lost their footing. The figure, the one with the glowing eyes, stood in the shadows, seemingly unaffected by the chaos they had just caused. Za'ira's breath was quick, her eyes locked on the mysterious figure. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond right away, its glowing eyes scanning them both with unsettling precision. Then it took a step forward, the air around it shimmering, almost as if the darkness itself clung to the figure's movements. "I don't need to explain myself," it said, its voice cold and clinical. "But it seems like you're too curious to just walk away." Za'ira's hand shot out, grabbing Silas's wrist. He could feel the tension in her grip, familiar, sharp, but there was something else there too, fear. And something more, he could sense her desire for him, not for herself but for him. The realization hit Silas like a gut punch. Za'ira had always been the strong one, the one who had led them through danger after danger. But now it was clear. She wasn't just worried about escaping. She was worried about keeping him alive, and he would do the same. The figure continued its slow advance, and Silas stood up, instinctively pulling Za'ira behind him. "What do you want?" he demanded, trying to mask the tension in his voice. The figure paused for a moment, as if considering Silas's question. Then, without warning, it raised its hand. A bolt of energy shot out, slamming into the floor between them, sending an explosion of sparks in every direction. Za'ira ducked, pulling Silas down with her as the blast left scorch marks on the walls around them. The connection was growing between them, and he was beginning to appreciate her instincts. The figure didn't seem to be in any rush. It spoke again, this time its voice tinged with a mocking undertone. "I don't have time for you. You can't stop what's coming. Then why even try?" Silas shot back, standing again. He gritted his teeth, the adrenaline surging through his veins and the desire he had for Za'ira burning hot under his skin. His pulse thudded in his ears, but he couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. Anything. Za'ira pulled him down again, just as another blast ricocheted past them. "Don't provoke it, Silas." But the damage was done. The figure tilted its head, and for the briefest of moments, Silas thought it smiled. The air around it seemed to ripple, and the faint hum of energy built up, filling the space with a palpable tension, a feeling that mirrored the tension and desire he had for Za'ira. "You've already chosen your side, human." Before Silas could react, the figure flicked its hand in a dismissive gesture. The ground beneath them suddenly shuddered, and a violent force slammed into Silas's chest, throwing him backward into the wall. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, and for a moment he could barely think. Za'ira was beside him in an instant, her hand on his chest as if checking for injuries, but Silas wasn't focused on the pain. His head was swimming with the realization that they were losing ground. This wasn't a battle they could win. The figure's voice rang out again, louder now. "This city will fall, and you, Za'ira, will be its final witness." Something in Za'ira's expression faltered, but before Silas could say anything, she shoved him aside, stepping forward with a renewed sense of purpose. "You won't take anything from me." The figure paused, clearly surprised. Za'ira's posture was different now, a fierce determination lighting her up from within. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. This wasn't about escaping or running. It was personal. She locked eyes with Silas, an unspoken promise passing between them. For a brief moment, there was a flicker in the figure's eyes, something akin to recognition. but it was gone in an instant. Za'ira's voice was low and steady. "If you want a fight, I'll give you one." The figure looked almost amused, as if they had just walked into a trap of their own making. "You're too late." But Silas knew better than to let them think they were losing. He pushed himself up, his legs wobbly from the impact, but his resolve firm. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not with everything at stake and not with Za'ira at his side. Za'ira moved first, leaping toward the figure with lightning speed. Silas watched as she dodged a pulse of energy, moving in a blur that left the figure looking confused for a split second. But it was enough. Za'ira had made her move. She struck, her fist connecting with the figure's chest in a powerful blow. The figure staggered back, but only for a moment. It recovered too quickly, its glowing eyes now narrowed with rage. Silas didn't waste any more time. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and ran toward the figure, swinging it hard. The pipe made contact with the figure's side, but it didn't even flinch. Za'ira was already in motion, her movements precise as she landed another blow. But this time, there was something different about the strike, a finality to it. The figure reeled back, its hand clutching at its chest as if trying to steady itself. It took one last look at them, and in that moment Silas saw something flicker in its eyes, fear. But before he could make sense of it, the figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows with a burst of energy that left the air sizzling in its wake. Za'ira stood still for a moment, panting, her gaze still locked on the spot where the figure had stood. Silas approached cautiously, his hand on her shoulder. "You good?" She didn't answer right away, but after a long beat she nodded. "We keep moving." She looked at Silas, her gaze searching, and he could see a deep well of vulnerability behind the power. They had no time to dwell on what had just happened. There was still more to come, more enemies to face, more dangers. But for now they had survived, and that would have to be enough. They took a deep breath, ready to face the unknown ahead together. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow, his body still tense from the encounter. The air was thick with the lingering scent of ozone and the weight of what had just transpired. Za'ira had fought fiercely, but it was clear that the figure, whatever it was, had been far more than a mere adversary. They couldn't afford to linger here. As much as Silas wanted to understand more about what they were facing, the priority was survival and escape. He looked at Za'ira, and a new layer of emotion was beginning to bloom within him. Za'ira turned toward the tunnel's end, her face unreadable, but there was a fire in her eyes. She wasn't done. Silas was beginning to suspect that she never would be. "There's a way out ahead. We can reach the surface if we hurry." Her voice was steady, but Silas could hear the underlying tension. She was trying to mask her concern, but it was still there, looming just beneath the surface. But he also sensed that she felt a pull to him, as strongly as he felt it for her. Silas nodded, following her lead as they hurried down the passage, every step echoing off the stone walls. The further they went, the more disorienting the tunnels became. They had been underground for what felt like hours, and the constant change in direction had left him feeling a little dizzy. The distant hum of engines still hung in the air, an ever-present reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. The figure they had just encountered was only a taste of the greater threat that was hunting them. Silas couldn't help but wonder how many more would follow. He pushed those thoughts away. Right now he had to focus on Za'ira. Za'ira seemed to sense his thoughts. "We'll lose them once we hit the surface, but we'll need a plan and allies." Her eyes met his. An unspoken understanding passed between them, a bond that was growing stronger by the minute. She was right. They had no idea how much longer they could keep running before they'd be cornered. He needed to trust her. They needed to trust each other, now more than ever. The feeling was mutual. The narrow tunnel eventually opened into a large, dilapidated maintenance chamber. Broken pipes hung from the ceiling like skeletal remains, and rusted machinery littered the floor. The faint light from a single flickering bulb illuminated their path, casting an eerie glow over the disarray. The place felt old and forgotten, like the remnants of a lost civilization. Za'ira stopped just inside, her eyes scanning the space quickly. There was no telling what lay beyond. "We'll take the elevator," she said, her voice suddenly quieter, more urgent. Silas raised an eyebrow. "The elevator? Here?" "Yes," she replied, almost impatiently. "It's our best shot, trust me." She reached for his hand and grasped it, the touch sending a jolt of electricity through him. He didn't argue. As much as the idea of relying on old, broken technology seemed risky, Za'ira had led them this far, and Silas trusted her more than anyone. She moved toward the far corner of the chamber, where an old control panel sat, its surface scratched and covered in dust. Za'ira's fingers danced over the buttons, the faint sound of machinery grinding beneath her touch. The elevator doors opened with a grating screech, and Silas couldn't help but wince at the sound. The elevator itself was small, barely fitting the two of them side by side. It looked like something out of a bygone era, clunky and outdated, but it would get them to the surface. They stepped inside and Za'ira pressed a button. The elevator groaned as it slowly began its ascent, the walls creaking as if in protest. Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a familiar sensation by now, an unnerving awareness of being just one step ahead of whatever enemy was tracking them. He also couldn't ignore the fact that Za'ira was next to him, her body touching his. "Za'ira," Silas started, his voice low, the small space making his breath tickle her ear. "What exactly are we up against? Who was that person back there?" He could feel the heat radiating from her, and it made his body tingle. Za'ira's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be deep in thought, weighing whether or not to share more. "They're part of a larger faction," she said at last, her tone measured. "A faction that has been hunting my kind for years, and now they've set their sights on you. You weren't supposed to be involved." Her hand moved up to cup his cheek and she looked directly into his eyes. Silas frowned. "What do you mean? I didn't ask for any of this." He reached for her hand and laced his fingers with hers. Za'ira's gaze softened for just a moment before she turned her eyes back toward the rising tunnel. "I know, but they won't stop until they find us, until they find me." She looked at Silas again, her eyes full of emotion. It wasn't just a concern for herself anymore, and he knew that. It was a concern for them both. The words hit Silas harder than he expected. In that moment, he realized just how much was at stake, not just for his own survival, but for hers as well. He was in this for the long haul now, and that terrified him as much as it excited him. The elevator jolted to a stop, and Za'ira immediately moved to open the doors. Beyond was the surface, freedom. But it was clear that their escape was far from over. As they stepped out into the moonlit night, the cold air hit Silas's skin like a shockwave. He breathed it in deeply, the weight of their underground ordeal slowly lifting from his shoulders. He felt Za'ira reach for him, and he was ready. Za'ira looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was something there. A flicker of emotion she hadn't shown before. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We've only just begun," she whispered. "Stay with me, Silas." He nodded, his heart racing as he turned to face the horizon. The city loomed in the distance, its lights flickering in the darkness, but he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something much larger, something that neither of them could escape from now. But he didn't want to escape it. Za'ira stepped forward, her hand brushing against his arm, the connection between them solidifying in a way that was hard to ignore. He felt the weight of her touch, the promise of what was to come. They didn't know what the future held, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. He could feel the undeniable pull between them, an unyielding desire for each other. They both knew that their relationship had changed. As they made their way into the unknown, one thing was clear. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight for their survival had just begun. The promise of something else was present in the air between them, and they both knew they would eventually explore it. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would do it side by side. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thrilling sci-fi adventures, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this universe.